and welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. Fired up to get you set for the week ahead in the Big Ten. And we have got to start with what is looking like one of the most exciting conference races in all of college football. You can count them up there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 teams with one loss or less in conference play. You got some heavy hitters up there, number 2, 3, and 4 in the rankings. You've got Cinderella stories like Indiana. Look, great start for Illinois as well. And now we got to figure out who's going to make it to Indianapolis. Pleased to welcome Danny Cannell, Bud Elliott, Tom Fornelli. I'm Chip Patterson. All right, so you saw it right there. Danny, when you start to look at this Big Ten title picture, you've got the teams that we knew were going to be there. You've got your Ohio State. You've got Oregon, which, of course, just got the win against the Buckeyes. Penn State, which awaits a visit from Ohio State here coming up in Week 10. Then you've got an Indiana team that's one of the great stories of the season. They are undefeated. And then you've got Iowa, which has already taken a loss to Ohio State, but does not have any games left that look particularly daunting for the Hawkeyes. You know, as you start to put this thing together, Danny, where do you think the Big Ten title race will hinge or pivot coming down the second half of the season?
Shock to anybody that I do think it's a 3-team race. As much as I like Indiana and what they've done, you know, you're kind of waiting for them to slip up. And maybe it's this weekend. They have a challenge this weekend that I know we're going to talk about. But the 3-team race, I think, is interesting because I think a lot of people think it's a 2-team race. But I thought what Penn State did going to USC, having the win on the road, was really impressive. I thought it was a big step forward for Drew Aller, who really stepped up in that stage. And I actually was kind of encouraged that he was able, like, taking risks and throwing ball down the field, even though he did have 3 interceptions. I think you can clean those up. And then most importantly, the fact that they play Ohio State at home. And I know Ohio State has absolutely owned them recently, and they haven't beat them in quite some time. But I do think Penn State is still very much in this race. So I think it's a 3-team race. I'd love to see the Cinderella story of Indiana continue. Maybe they have a chance if there is some sort of, 3-way tie for that one-loss team. But I do think Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State are clearly in the driver's seat, and the teams that I believe are going to be in this race when we come down to championship weekend.
Dan, I don't really disagree with any of that. There are 3 teams, and I think the odds would suggest you're right on this. It is mostly a 3-team race. You mentioned Indiana. They have a path to get there. Do they have a real path to win? I don't know. Like, we want to see Indiana step up against a little bit higher caliber competition. They'll face some of that, as we'll talk about soon, in Big Game Breakdown later in this show. If there is one, though, that you're like, maybe, just maybe, like a material change could happen. What could make one of these teams that are a little more down ballot on the current odds screen, what could make them live to win the conference? I think it would potentially be this Michigan offense taking a major step forward under Jack Tuttle. I know they already have, obviously, multiple losses, but they still get to play a couple of the teams who are in front of them in the standing. Michigan still controls its own destiny for the most part, I think, in a lot of the simulations, to get to the Big Ten title game. I'm not predicting that they will. I'm just trying to spice this up a little bit. Like, is there anything Iowa could really do? Like, are they going to learn how to play really good offense against good defenses? Probably not. We already saw them play Ohio State. But maybe, just maybe, if Michigan can get the offense going with Jack Tuttle, we know the defense is still really good. So I'm a little bit intrigued there.
I want to put it on the record, put it on blast all across social media. Bud Elliott says that the Michigan offense is about to turn around under Jack Tuttle and win the Big Ten. I do agree with you a bit there. When you try to find the down ballot teams, Danny, you're right. Indiana's a great story. I really have a difficult time anticipating that they will get to Indianapolis, and if they do somehow get there, they will end up winning the Big Ten title. I think that if you look past Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State for a team that can challenge, I'm with you. But I think Michigan is one of those teams you have to look at as the most likely candidate to kind of break through if they get things in order, if that offense fixes itself. And we'll find out. We'll talk about it later in a Big Game Breakdown. They've got a pretty good test this weekend on the road against Illinois. We'll see how Michigan looks and if they can get things in order. But I do think that it is that trio at the top, the Buckeyes, the Ducks, and the Nittany Lions, who are the ones of the obvious candidates who are going to end up winning this league. And of those three, to be blunt, I have far more faith in Oregon and Ohio State than I do Penn State at this point. I think that, obviously the Nittany Lions went on the road. They got a big win against USC. Drew Aller made some big throws to kind of help them lead the comeback. Tyler Warren had a huge game. It's just, I don't think that offense is at the same level overall as the Ohio State and the Oregon offense have shown the ability to be, and we saw on Saturday night in Autzen. So I tend to think that while there are three teams that are realistic candidates, I still think it's mostly a two-horse race, and it's the two teams we just saw play Saturday night.
Okay, Tom. So if Oregon's playing with that egg in a spoon, right? They're undefeated in conference play. They've got the head-to-head win against the Buckeyes. They've still got to go to Michigan. They've still got to go play Illinois. They are still a top 5 team playing at Purdue. Coming out of the win against Ohio State, what was your strongest takeaway about Oregon in terms of its ability, let's just say, to run the table the rest of the way in the Big Ten?
I'm happy you mentioned the Purdue game, Chip, because any Big Ten fan knows that you don't overlook a night game in West Lafayette when you're highly ranked. Crazy things happen. So Oregon has to take that one seriously. But my primary takeaway from that game was how good Dylan Gabriel looked. Like, he's not been bad this season. He hasn't been excellent, but I feel like watching him play against Ohio State, that was the best Dylan Gabriel's not only looked in an Oregon uniform, I think it's the best he's looked in a few years. He was able to move the ball down the field and hit some big plays, but throughout Dylan Gabriel's career, he's mostly been a guy who's done that to the left side of the field. He was using all parts of the field against Ohio State, and that was a very good defense he was going up against. So if Dylan Gabriel plays at that level that we saw Saturday night for the rest of the season, this is a really tough team to beat because, yes, that defense did give up yards and it did give up points, but it was without one of its best players in Jordan Birch. So as that side of the ball gets healthier again for the Ducks, and if the offense keeps humming at that level where we saw Evan Stewart finally take a step up and really have an impact in the game for the first time this year, it's a really tough team to beat. Like you said, they've got a couple tough road games that they've got to play still to get, past. And there's always, the risk of stepping on a landmine and losing a game. But the fact that they got that win over Ohio State and they have that tiebreaker gives them a bit more margin of error to make sure that at the very minimum, they end up getting to Indianapolis and get a shot to win the Big Ten title.
Look, Tom, if they can block Ohio State, they can block anybody in this conference. Maybe not Michigan, but how often do you need to block to beat Michigan, right? Like you need to score a certain number of points, but it's not that large number of points with all due respect to the Wolverines offense, unless, of course, Jack Tuttle has that big step up. It's weird. Like Oregon had more close games than Ohio State did entering this ball game, right? Like, and you would have thought that maybe Oregon would have had to show a little bit more in their prior games than they did, obviously, than Ohio State did, because Ohio State had mostly blowouts. And yet it's almost as if Oregon was able to hold more stuff back. Like Oregon had more successful downfield shots in this game than I think they had in any of their other 3 games combined. So clearly they had held some stuff back. And for me, with the Ducks, like Birch is an injury we'll have to monitor, certainly. Will they ever get Bedford back on the interior of the offensive line? But if Evan Stewart's going to play like that, that changes my thoughts on this team quite a bit, because Evan Stewart was a 5-star recruit. He has like 5-star, top half of the draft type talent. Trayshawn Holden's already pretty good. Barber's pretty good. If you're going to get that Evan Stewart, then we have to start talking about Oregon as like the best receiving core in the country and a like legitimate national title contender. But he had not played that way so far this year. Like, that's a great time to have a breakout ball game.
I think the only thing that can beat Oregon is themselves. And just the way the season has gone, there is more parity. And I know we preach this on our Cover 3 show, and not necessarily here, but like there's a couple trap games for them. And I don't think Michigan would be the trap game because of the brand, but it is on the road. And usually you would look for a trap game on the road. But I was a part of a team that was number 1 in the country. It was November, late October, and we went to Virginia, and it was kind of, a game we thought we would waltz in there. We were probably, I don't remember the point spread. We were probably, a double-digit favorite in that game. We kind of played okay. We were playing fine. And then all of a sudden you look up the scoreboard in the fourth quarter. It's like, oh my gosh, we're trailing. Could that be Wisconsin, who all of a sudden they have an offensive outburst versus Rutgers? Again, it's really hard to predict which game it would come against, but I really feel like that's the only thing that would slow down Oregon. They should be better than every team they face, but is there a game where Dylan Gabriel slips up and has a couple interceptions, and one of them's a pick six, and then all of a sudden it's closer than you think? But, and just one more player, when we mentioned Jordan Birch going down, Mateo Uyunglele was phenomenal in his absence. You go back and watch that game again, how many plays he was making, disrupting offensive linemen, even if the sack total or tackle for loss total wasn't up there, the impact he had was huge in Jordan Birch's absence. So not only are they talented across the starting front, but they have some depth too, which is really what separates these top tier teams that we're talking about.
Great call, Danny. Oregon, in the small sample size of the Dan Lanning era, doesn't really have bad losses, but Ducks fans will tell you there have been plenty of times when they've been knocking on that door for the breakthrough and just haven't been able to get that last step. Something's got to give, especially coming out of one of the biggest wins of the entire college football season. The Ducks taking down Ohio State in Eugene on Saturday night. Well, coming up on the other side, we turn our attention to the week ahead with our first of two big game breakdowns, and it's big time on CBS, Michigan and Illinois, keys to the game and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. One of the things we like to do every single time we're with you is to get you set for the weekend ahead in the Big Ten with something that we here on the Cover 3 podcast like to call the Big Game Breakdown. We're going to take you inside the matchup because the picks, the best bets, well, that happens on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern time over on youtube.com/cover3. We want to go a little bit deeper than that right now. So we're going to begin with the game that you can see on CBS, America's most watched network, the network of stars, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to be Michigan and Illinois. And for absolutely no reason at all, Tom, I'm going to start with you. What's going to stand out the most about this matchup in terms of where it's going to be decided?
I mean, besides the fact I'm actually going to be able to watch my Illini play on CBS and 3:30 on a Saturday, that's pretty great. But just the fact that both teams are also ranked at the same time is also one of the more amazing, unexpected parts of this matchup when I originally saw it on the schedule before the season began. But I do think this is a very interesting game. We talked about it in the first segment, how Michigan is kind of that dark horse down the odds board kind of team that could back into the Big Ten title race, but they have no more room for error. They have to win out if they want to make that a realistic expectation. And this is going to be an interesting matchup because we did see, since Jack Tuttle came in and took over for Alex Orji in that loss to Washington a couple weeks ago, the Michigan offense did perform better than it had been, but it's still not an offense that, you would look at and say this is a very explosive, very dangerous unit. But what Michigan has been very good at all season long, no matter who the quarterback was, is running the football. And I think in this matchup, that is the one thing that we'll be looking at for Michigan on offense, because if Illinois' defense, if you look at their overall numbers, it's very good, even considering what happened in the second half against Purdue on Saturday. But the one thing Illinois kind of had trouble with defensively is stopping the run. They rank 107th nationally in EPA allowed per rush, 96th in explosive play rate on the ground, and 122nd in defensive success rate against the run. We saw a couple weeks ago that they did a good job of keeping Penn State's running backs from being able to hit the long 40 to 50-yard touchdown runs, but they were still giving up 10 to 12 yards before they finally made those ankle tackles to stop them. So can Illinois figure out a way to stop the Michigan run game, which is, with Kalel Mullings and Donovan Edwards has been very successful so far this season. And that's going to be one key for me in this one. And on the other side, can Michigan stop Illinois' passing attack? Because this is an Illinois team that offensively has been pretty explosive on the season, and they've done most of their damage in the air. Illinois conversely ranks 25th in EPA per dropback and 11th in explosive pass rate. And Luke Altmaier has been a big reason why. He's taken a huge step forward in his second year in Barry Lunney's offense. He's been making good decisions. He has not been turning the ball over, which was a huge problem that he dealt with last season. And if you look at this Michigan defense so far, Will Johnson has been fantastic in the secondary. The rest of that unit has not been anything special. And you look at Illinois, they've got two receivers in Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin are two of the better receivers in the Big Ten. My guess is that Will Johnson will spend a lot of time shadowing Pat Bryant, who has been the more explosive option for Illinois in the passing attack. But can somebody stop Zachary Franklin from getting all those catches underneath and getting some yak, which is what he's been specializing in all season? It's going to be interesting to see how Michigan tries to take that away, whether they do it with pressure and blitzing, which is how they've had to do it. And while Luke Altmaier has not turned the ball over, when he has been pressured and sacked, he has shown a propensity to take sacks. So it's going to be interesting to see how that matchup plays out too.
Tom, I think you said it. And while I think it's going to be Tuttle for Michigan, man, if I'm that Michigan coaching staff, I'm watching what Purdue did last week with that quarterback run, getting 17 quarterback runs for backup quarterback Ryan Brown. And look, certainly some of it was successful because I don't think that Illinois anticipated the defensive head coach of Purdue, Ryan Walters, taking over offensive play calling and breaking out what I don't know if it's an entirely new scheme, but it was pretty close to a brand new scheme. If I'm Michigan, I'm watching that and I'm saying, man, I want to go to Jack Tuttle. There's no doubt. I think he gives more passing options to this offense than Alex Orji. But we did just watch a pretty terrible Purdue team run for 239 using a lot of that 11-man run game. This is a game that I had circled in the preseason for our Locks pod that we do on the Cover 3 podcast Thursday at 11 a.m. Because like Tom said, preseason's like, I don't think Illinois has the bulk up front to hold up against the better run games in the Big Ten. But Michigan has been very up and down, I think largely because you don't have to respect the pass. Can they rush the ball effectively out of a 10-man run game and not 11-man run game when Jack Tuttle is in there? I think they probably can, but I mean, as Tom said, that pass defense has been leaky. So we'll see if Illinois can score with them.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys say. I'm not that worried about the Purdue game. As you guys mentioned, new quarterback was in there. They did a lot of things they hadn't done with Hudson Card before, specifically the quarterback run game. I think the game plan is pretty simple to stop Michigan. It's shut down the run game. It shut down Colston Loveland, and good luck to the receivers. If Samaj Morgan beats you, like, okay, you may give up a pass to him. But I think the quarterback play, no matter who it's been, has been so second rate that it really does. They tip their hand so much that I'm not that worried about Illinois' defense being at least able to contain them more so than they did against Purdue. And then the one thing I would say about Luke Altmaier, and totally agree, he's playing awesome. This game in particular with Michigan's front seven, he takes a lot of sacks, as you mentioned, Tom. He's got to get rid of the football. Like, you can't, especially on first and second down, so that you're in positive situations. In a game like this, sacks can really penalize you. It's okay to throw the football away. He's got to get rid of the football just a little bit quicker. So that's something I would look out for because, man, if you start setting yourself back on, 2nd and 12 or 3rd and 14, long yardage situations, that is not a recipe for success no matter where it is. And the offensive line has been playing better than I think the sack rate would demonstrate. So I think some of that's on Luke Altmaier to get rid of the football. So I'll be curious to see if they fix that or address that, because in this game, I think it's one that could kind of burn you because Michigan does have that front seven that still can get after you and really hurt a quarterback if you don't get it out of your hands. But I love the matchups. Receivers, as you guys mentioned, throw away from Will Johnson, whoever away from him, and you got to like your chances there. So I like Illinois to be able to move the football through the air against this Michigan defense.
But why do you think, because you mentioned it at the beginning, when we were talking about the Big Ten title race, and clearly we're starting to get into it, unpacking Saturday's matchup against Illinois. Are you surprised that Jack Tuttle has emerged as that option or as that potential answer to unlock the Michigan passing attack? As we looked at all three quarterbacks, or as we tried to consider what might happen, I know you had mentioned before on the Cover 3 podcast that it was, largely believed that Tuttle wasn't quite healthy at the start of the season. Now he's finally getting healthy, so that's why you're starting to see him again. But we've known about Jack Tuttle for a really long time. Now, what have you seen so far from him in the maize and blue that might give you the notion, if you were on that coaching staff, that going with Jack Tuttle, maybe in this game, but also in the bigger picture, is going to help Michigan's passing attack?
To steal a line from our buddy Josh Pate, remember what I said and what I didn't say. I didn't say Jack Tuttle was a good option. I just said he was the best option for Michigan. Okay.
Got it.
There may not be any good options for Michigan. He might just be the best one. So what have we seen from him? We've seen him go into a hostile road environment in a game in which he did not start at Washington. And we have seen him be willing to fire the football and at least take chances. We have seen him be able to operate the RPO game. And like RPO, of course, means handoff or throw, not handoff or run with it. We're actually using the term right here on Cover 3. So we've seen him be able to operate the RPO game. Like they can run some of that glance stuff. They can run some dart and some stuff off that. Like it does operate, like kind of open up some stuff a little bit operationally for this Michigan offense. And even if I don't think, and I'm assuming unless you guys have changed your opinion, that maybe we don't think all that highly of these Michigan receivers, with Colston Loveland getting a little healthier down the stretch, I just think they have to open it up. Like you stole a couple wins, not stole, but like you were able to kind of squeak out a couple wins with Alex Orji, including that awesome one over USC just a couple weeks ago. But at some point, like that is crazy one-dimensional just to operate basically like a Navy or an Air Force. And to be frank, Navy throws it better than Michigan does this year. So not running triple option in Ann Arbor, I guess, is the best option for the Wolverines.
Yeah, I just think they missed on Alex Orji. I think that's what it boils down to. And so now that they realize how bad it was and how little they could passing game they could have, and as you mentioned, going to an extremely run-based offense, they're looking at it saying we can't, as physical as we can get, we can't beat teams being that one-dimensional. So Jack Tuttle gives you a little bit more experience. I mean, the dude's 25 years old. He's been around a lot. He hasn't played very much, but he gives you some veteran experience. As good of a story Davis Warren was, I don't think he probably was the most talented passer. So when Tuttle's healthy, it's okay, let's try this one. But I think it boils down to Michigan really missing on Alex Orji. And maybe, some guys are great in practice, and I don't know how, because we've all discussed it. Like, why didn't they go get somebody in the portal? Why didn't they bring somebody in? I think they just misevaluated Alex Orji.
All right, Tom, final word to you. Again, our best bets, our picks for this game and more. You can find them Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern time at youtube.com/cover3. Leans, thoughts on how this thing's going to end up playing out?
No leans here. I'm going to tell you exactly how it's going to play out. Illinois is going to beat Michigan on Saturday in a sold-out Memorial Stadium. It is disrespectful that the Wolverines will be coming to Champaign as favorites. Illinois has been the better football team all season long. Illinois has already gone on the road and beaten good teams. Michigan hasn't. They're going to find themselves in a whole lot of trouble on Saturday. Illini by $1 billion.
Let's go. All right. Completely clear-eyed, unbiased analysis of the outcome of Saturday's game on CBS, Michigan and Illinois. Well, coming up on the other side, we mentioned it earlier, one of the great stories, not just in this conference, but throughout all of college football, has been Indiana. And the Hoosiers have one of their toughest tests yet going up against Nebraska. We'll give that one the big game breakdown treatment next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network, taking a look at some of the biggest games in the Big Ten for the upcoming weekend, giving it the big game breakdown treatment. And we are going to go inside the matchup for Indiana against Nebraska. Now, this Hoosiers team, here on the Cover 3 podcast, we were all in on Curt Cignetti. We knew that with what he had done at James Madison and with what he, sort of brought in terms of an infusion of energy, an infusion of confidence, that this would be, someone to buy a little bit of stock in. Well, if you didn't have yesterday's price, I'm sorry, because it's not today's price. So let's go big picture here, just focusing on Indiana, Danny. What's really impressed you about the way that Indiana has handled its business off to this very impressive 6-0 start?
I know we're going to talk about, the competition they've faced, and it has been a lighter schedule, but they've dominated that schedule. That to me has been the most impressive. Even when it looked like they were getting tested against Maryland and it was a closer game, they pull away late. Same thing at Northwestern, tricky game early, they pull away late. That to me has been most impressive, is they have sort of a killer instinct mentality for a program that has lacked any sort of identity. They've got a killer instinct to go for the jugular and finish off teams, which go look at some of the top teams that let teams hang around the second half, finally win by maybe a touchdown or so. Indiana has been dominating their opponents in the second half. It has been really, really impressive. And I think that's a direct result of the mindset and the attitude and the mentality that Kirk Zanetti has brought in there.
Dan, I completely agree. Getting this version of Curtis Rourke has been so huge for Indiana. I mean, like, you're basically just dropping one of the best quarterbacks in the country when healthy, and he hasn't been healthy for the large part of like the last 2 years. You're putting him in an offense that already had nice weapons. This offense had some nice weapons last year, and then they upgraded via the transfer portal. A lot of the guys following, Cignetti from JMU. This is a really dangerous offense, and so far, an opportunistic defense. I'm really excited to see what it does, though, against a different challenge, I think, in Nebraska. And really, if you look at it, remember, Indiana lost Nick Kidwell, one of their best offensive linemen in the preseason, one of the best guards potentially in the Big Ten. The last team that was really good throwing the football that maybe occasionally had some questions on the offensive line. I think Indiana's better than Colorado, but you see where I'm going here. Nebraska was able to kind of light box them, got home with a couple sim pressures, got a lot of pressure in Shedeur Sanders' face thanks to the polar bear there in the middle. I am curious because if you look at Indiana's schedule, this is kind of the first test they will have faced from a really good interior pass rushing defensive line. So that's the new test for me in this ballgame. Can they handle that well? Can Rourke handle guys pressure up the middle if Nebraska's able to get it?
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on something that's very important for this matchup. I mean, the thing that's been impressive about Indiana is even against a light schedule, as dominant as they've been, it's like typically there's a team where you can find a weakness, something that you're genuinely concerned about, but they're playing well in all facets of the football team. So it's one reason to think that this isn't just a fluke and a byproduct of who they have played. But as Bud was just touching on, there are some concerns going into this matchup because part of the situation that you deal with when you play an easier schedule is you're not really battle tested. So when you end up in a game like this where you're probably going to have to deal with more than you've seen so far, it'll be interesting to see how you're going to respond to it, considering you haven't seen it. Now, Curtis Rourke's been around for a long time. He's got plenty of experience. But if you look at this matchup, both of these teams defensively have been phenomenal at pressuring opposing quarterbacks. Nebraska ranks 5th nationally in pressure rate. Indiana ranks 9th. Both of these quarterbacks have been a lot worse when pressured than they have been in a clean pocket. I know that's a shocking revelation for any quarterback out there, but it's true. And part of the problem is for Curtis Rourke, if you look at him this season, he's dropped back 177 times. He's only been pressured on 25 of them. He has not really been in that situation very often. So it'll be interesting to see how he handles it when it comes, because it is going to come in this game. And on the other side, Nebraska's got a pretty darn good quarterback themselves in freshman Dylan Raiola, who has been excellent for a true freshman. But just like Rourke, when he's been under pressure, and he has been pressured far more often than Rourke has been so far, he makes bad decisions and he makes bad throws that have impacted Nebraska. So for me, looking at this matchup, I think that is something that on Saturday is going to be critical to determine who's going to end up winning this game.
Yeah, Tom, I wanted to build out on that, the Dylan Raiola of it all. 6 games in, they got an off week. If you're sitting there on that offensive staff, and if you're working with Dylan, what are we doing to try to make sure that he's ready to be able to take on this challenge? Because look, I know that we don't always think that Bloomington is this like great home field advantage, but I know that with the excitement that is there and the way that they have latched on to Coach Sig, that I expect that this will be a very, very noticeable and impactful atmosphere on Saturday for the Cornhuskers to go in and play against. What does Dylan Raiola look like here with like a mid-season grade, and what does he need to do to improve going forward?
I think that if you just try to base it on the curve of him being a true freshman QB, he's graded very well. He's made a lot of very good plays. He's also had the kind of freshman bumps in the road that you expect. And he does have weaknesses. Like when we saw against Illinois, when they started getting pressure on him in that loss, the only game Nebraska's lost all season, he would kind of throw the ball up and just kind of, heave prayers, hoping for the best outcome. So I think you're going to try to coach that out of him for this game, but you're going to try to coach that out of any quarterback. So I think if you look at this matchup in particular, if I'm Nebraska, the one thing I feel like I can take advantage of here with Raiola and with my offense against this Indiana defense is the size mismatch in the receiving game. If you look at Nebraska's top receivers, Isaiah Nayor and Jamal Banks, they're both 6'4". Tight end Thomas Fidone is 6'6". You look at Indiana's depth chart, particularly in the secondary, there's only one guy back there who's over 6 feet tall. It's Amare Farrell. He is 6'2". Everybody else is 5'10" or shorter. So the game plan for me, if I'm Nebraska, is I'm telling Dylan Raiola, we've got giant wide receivers. Let's use them. Let's put the ball up and get some jump ball situations if we have to. Let's get them, in one-on-one situations on the perimeter and see if our guys can beat their guys, because I do think they can. They haven't gotten a ton of credit. Dylan Raiola gets a lot of attention because of his hype coming in and how he has performed. But Nayor and Banks are two very good receivers, and I think that is something that Indiana has to solve more than Nebraska has to solve them.
I think Tom really hit on it. It's also worth asking, how good is Indiana's pass rush? I think it's pretty darn good. Kamara is he was a dude in the Sun Belt. He's been a dude so far in the Big Ten. He's probably going to be a guy who's going to be a good NFL player. So I have some confidence that Indiana's pass rush is for real. But it is worth asking, have they played a competent offensive line so far? I would say Maryland, the answer is clearly no. If we saw what they did the other night on Friday against Northwestern, Maryland's had major problems in the offensive line so far. UCLA has improved a little bit down the stretch, to be frank, but they played them very early in the season when UCLA was having a hard time even remember to put 10 guys out on field goal teams. So, there have been some challenges, I think, for some of the teams. And that's a new staff, obviously. Charlotte was playing a backup quarterback. That was kind of a mess. Who else did they play? UCLA, Charlotte, Northwestern. So not really anybody competent. I don't even think Nebraska's offensive line is world beaters. But I do think Nebraska's offensive line is probably the best offensive line Indiana will have faced by a good bit. And that'll be interesting to see how these DBs can hold up, because those DBs against Maryland actually did not hold up all that well, despite the fact that Indiana was getting home early and often with their pressure. So I think Tom's point is a really important one here. Maryland made plays on those guys. Now, Billy Edwards good, and he had a bunch of pressure in his face and still made it happen. But those receivers also made it happen. I think they probably will put this game in Raiola's hands.
This, to me, is Indiana's biggest challenge as far as a defensive front that they will face. And I think it's also, it's in the trenches for both sides. The one thing I would like to see Nebraska do more for Dylan Raiola, I think they've got a little bit, and you're right, they've been putting the ball in his hands maybe too much. Their run game has not been that effective. Maybe something I didn't see coming is how reliant they would be on Dylan Raiola early this season. They have not been able to be very dominant. They were under 100 yards rush versus Rutgers. And if you look at any quarterback, you look at his numbers, he's been sacked 6 times against Illinois in the overtime game, just once versus Purdue, which is a game they probably should have won by more, and then 4 sacks he had against Rutgers. So they've got to do a better job protecting him. I think they get it versus them, but on the flip side, that's what concerns me the most for Indiana, is facing the best defensive line they've faced all year. This will be the biggest challenge for them in the trenches. That, to me, is where I look at Nebraska as a really tough out for Indiana, because at the skill positions, I think they stack up really well. It's the offensive and defensive lines I think they'll face the biggest challenge.
Yeah, Danny, 2.3 yards per rush against Rutgers, 1.5 yards per rush against Illinois. It is an offense that sometimes does ask a lot from Lil Cuzzo, number 15, as Patrick Mahomes likes to call him. All right, Danny, real quick, let's toss it all around. Leans here. Again, best bets coming later in the week on Thursday. How do you think this one plays out?
I think it's going to be an awesome game. I think it's going to be fun. I think it's a fourth quarter game. My lean, Nebraska's in it in the fourth quarter. Can they close it out? And Indiana playing at home, what difference does that make?
Illinois threw it on Nebraska pretty well. I do think Curtis Rourke's going to be able to throw it on them well enough. And Indiana scores touchdowns in the red zone. They're 6th in the country in red zone touchdown percentage. Nebraska has a major problem on special teams in a close ball game. I'll take the quarterback, the special teams, and the touchdown scorers. Give me Indiana.
I'm always talking about how difficult it is to get through a regular season undefeated, and the teams that typically do are the elite teams with the elite talent. Indiana's got to lose eventually. I think that's first one comes this weekend.
Ooh,
we're giving out picks and everything. I thought we were just leaning. We're picking.
Hey, listen, Danny, you and I got a battle coming up, and I got a little 2-for-1 special on this one, so you just wait. But give me the Hoosiers. Give me a lot of points. All right, coming up on the other side, it's time to play Mythbusters, because everyone's talking about this time zone this and time zone that. Well, what should we actually take away from some of the travel-related results in the Big Ten? We'll get into all that and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, as we've got this new coast-to-coast Big Ten and 18-team league all the way from Piscataway all the way to Southern California, a lot of conversation going in was what the travel would be like for all of these teams. And as we've started to see it, the teams that are traveling more than a couple time zones are starting to pile up some of the losses. Now, before we get into sort of parsing the exact reasons why some of these results had happened, I wanted to throw it to somebody who actually did play in a coast-to-coast league. So, Danny, can you educate us and also, the Cover 3 audience at large? Do you, having played in the National Football League, do you give some credence to that idea that some of this time zone related travel can take an impact on performance?
I do. There's very much, when you talk about professional athletes, and we are talking about professional athletes now with college football, creatures of habit, right? You're creatures of routine. And even sometimes that routine is maybe a 1.5, 2 hour flight, which is pretty simple. It's down the street. You leave at the same time. You arrive at the same time. You eat the pregame meal at the same time. Everything is pretty much the same. Then all of a sudden you throw a wrench into it where that flight, which was maybe a 2 hour flight, all of a sudden a 4 or 5 hour flight. And it throws off everything. It throws off the preparation. Maybe even times you could be walking through normally on a Friday afternoon when you normally would depart. All of a sudden, you're on a plane. So the walkthrough gets cut short. Or maybe it's in a hotel ballroom. Once you arrive, your eating schedule is off. So I don't know if there's an exact number I would put to it. And I think the better teams usually, is it a point here? Maybe not. I think probably the bigger issue is the teams, and I never experienced this, going from the West Coast to the East Coast. UCLA last week playing a noon kick. That to me is almost unfair, especially at any age in your teens or early 20s, asking a player to be ready to go at 9 a.m. body clock. That is really rough. But I do think it's a challenge. And then you start stacking them, multiple road trips. That's when I think you really start to take its toll on your body.
Well, Tom, you were one of the first ones on this because, everyone was throwing out your 1-8. Now we've got more results to add on top of that. What have you found in terms of, let's play a little Mythbusters? What's beneath the surface of some of these results?
Well, first of all, my favorite part of the 1-8 stat that was floating around before last weekend was that we were only counting conference games because apparently travel only matters when you're playing a conference opponent. When you're playing Hawaii or somebody and you have to fly out to the islands, it doesn't matter. But after last week's games, including non-conference games, the teams that now travel are 4-12 overall, which is bad. Like that, you're only winning, 25% of the time. Nobody's going to argue that's good. But when you dig under the hood, you find out that the favorites in those games are 13-3. So the teams that are expected to win these games are still winning these games. And by the way, the 3 losses, one was Ohio State's 1-point loss on the road against Oregon, in which they had a very good chance to win. And the other 2 were both USC as a road favorite against Michigan and a road favorite against Minnesota. Of those 3 losses, the only game that had a spread larger than 1 score was USC's loss to Minnesota, which they lost on a 4th-and-1 play call, which Minnesota scored in the last minute of the game to win. So is it time zones that are affecting the results, or is it just some teams are better than others? I'm not as sure.
But when you're building out the model, when you're trying to figure out home field advantage, like from the handicapping standpoint, how much weight are you putting into some of this travel, which is becoming more and more frequent in the major college football and the expanded universe?
Sure. So I think you have to account for it from a betting and handicapping standpoint, because if you don't, you're not going to likely have the correct number against the market. It's in the market, right? Like the smart handicappers are certainly using it. It's not the reason why you're deciding to pick a game on the Locks Pod, probably on the Thursday episode there on Cover 3 at 11. But I do think it's really important. And there are certain situations, like teams who have back-to-back long travel. And we've even seen Stanford at the ACC have a couple of this. Like, wow, I got to go back to the East Coast yet again. That can be kind of tricky. And I think Danny's point was great. Like, pro athletes struggle with this. College athletes have different demands. Sometimes they're a little bit less serious in terms of because it's a job kind of, but it's not really a job. Whereas in the pros, it's your job to be ready. So I do think college kids can be a little more affected by this for sure, especially with some of the weird start times.
Yeah, we will see a lot of examples of this, including, we've got USC will be playing an early game against Maryland. Oregon has to go to Purdue this weekend. You've got the UCLA Rutgers game that we've been talking about for a really long time. Los Angeles all the way to Piscataway. Some big matchups to be on the lookout for ahead in week 8 with some of that time zone travel. Well, coming up on the other side, we like to get you set going into each and every weekend with one player to watch. So each one of us have identified someone that we think will have an impactful, that will have a big impact on the Big Ten Conference this weekend. We'll let you know who next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast live on CBS Sports Network. We always like to send you off with one player to watch in the Big Ten for the upcoming weekend. Danny, who you got your eyes on in week 8?
I'll go back to a guy that we've mentioned on here before. Iowa's Caleb Johnson going to Michigan State to help, potentially Iowa move to 5-2. He has been so impressive. So much the conversation been Ashton Jeanty, what he's facing, but still Caleb Johnson does it without really any resemblance of a passing attack, where Cade McNamara, given the stat that he hadn't gone over 100 yards passing versus any Power 4 team. Against Washington, he went 7 yards over that number for a heaven and 107 yards passing. Caleb Johnson still getting it done despite facing loaded boxes and no passing game. It is super impressive. I can't wait to see what he does again this weekend.
We talked about him to open the segment. I think Jack Tuttle, the Michigan quarterback, assuming he is the guy going forward, he probably needs to have at least a decent day for Michigan to pull this off. If Michigan doesn't win, I kind of think their Big Ten title hopes are completely dashed. So Michigan has to go and get this one against Illinois. I think they're going to have to be a little more than one-dimensional, maybe not crazily so, but if Jack Tuttle takes care of the football, makes a couple throws, I think Michigan fans should be pretty happy come Saturday.
Oregon's coming off a huge win. They're playing on a short week at night on the road against Purdue. And while I don't really, truly believe they're going to be upset, I want to give one player a little bit of a shout out here because there's a lot of superstars on this team. We mentioned many of them, but there's another guy doing a lot of dirty work on that defense who doesn't get nearly the recognition. I'm talking about linebacker Bryce Betcher, who leads the team in tackles. He's helping them stop against the run. He's also doing a very good job as in pass coverage, dropping back and covering guys. He has an interception, not a surprise. He's a two-way athlete. He also plays baseball for the Ducks. I think he's going to be a big part of them making sure they don't have a letdown against the Spoilermakers.
I'm going to go to Indiana quarterback Curtis Rourke. He is currently leading the Big Ten in passer rating. He is currently leading the Big Ten in yards per attempt, up at 11 yards per attempt. He's got 14 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And I think the thing that's going to be so important for Rourke is being able to identify where he's got the advantage. Because we know that Nebraska, especially if they're getting Tommy Hill back, has someone who can body up almost anyone. But he's done a good job of spreading the ball around. So can he find the mismatch? That will be huge for Indiana's offense, which has done a good job the whole way. If you liked what you saw, if you liked what you heard, come and join us because the Cover 3 podcast is live at youtube.com/Cover3 every Monday, Wednesday, Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Of course, those best bets will be on the Lock Show on Thursday, and then Saturday nights, 11:30 p.m. Eastern time, we go live with our instant and raw reaction, recapping the day. Scan that QR code on the screen, and you can download the Cover 3 podcast wherever you get your podcasts.